The movie begins with an episode of a popular game show called To Tell the Truth. This particular episode features 3 contestants who all claim to be fabled Frank William Abagnale, who pretended to be an airline pilot, a lawyer, and a doctor. When the contestants are asked who captured Frank Abagnale, one of them replies that it was a policeman named Carl Hanratty. The scene then cuts to 1969, when FBI agent Carl Hanratty travels to a French jail to extradite a flu-stricken Frank Abagnale Jr., who tries to escape but is too sick to even reach the outdoors. Finally, Frank gives up and requests to be taken home. 6 years earlier, when Frank was just 16 years old, he lived with his French mother Paula and father Frank Abagnale Sr. Frank looks up to his father and is overjoyed to see him become a new Rochelle Rotary Club member. One day, his father wakes him up and drags him to a store, where he charms the store owner into opening the store a little earlier. With the new suit, Frank Jr. drives his father to the Chase Manhattan Bank and is told to act as his chauffeur to win over bank employees and obtain a loan. Unfortunately, the family is forced to move from their stately home to a modest apartment when the loan is denied due to many IRS tax frauds by Frank Sr. This leads to a conflict between Frank's parents. Frank enrolls in a public school and wears his old school's uniform on his first day. Frank walks to the front of the class and pretends to be the new class substitute teacher after some of the students in his class make fun of his uniform. He even sends the real substitute teacher away, saying there was an error. Before Frank is exposed and his parents are summoned in to talk about the situation, the ruse continues for a week. Frank's father is surprised at how far his son could get with the scam, while his mother is furious about it. Frank returns home shortly to learn that his parents are divorcing. Frank flees his house after being asked which of his parents he wants to stay with, using his checkbook to get free transportation and lodging. When Frank soon runs out of money, he tries to make fraudulent checks using his own checkbook. But this trick fails to work as the bank workers don't take him and his fake checks too seriously. After another failure, he notices some airline pilots getting treated like celebrities. Frank gets motivated by this and decides to pose as a fake pilot to win the bank workers' confidence. He poses as a college student writing a report on an airlines company and interviews one of its top retired pilots to con his way into getting a pilot's uniform and learning more about the career. Frank then creates a fraudulent airline check and successfully cashes it using the pilot uniform and his charisma. Even a bank manager who previously rejected him falls for the scam. Frank then continues to use this trick on hotels throughout New York. Using the airline stickers which he gets from toy planes, Frank continues making more and more fake checks. Soon, Frank takes his trick further and uses his fake pilot uniform to get free air flights. During this, he charms a flight stewardess and has his first sexual encounter. Next, he buys a check coding machine from an auction to enhance his schemes and generate checks. Meanwhile, an FBI agent named Carl Hanratty has learned of Frank's check fraud and follows the most recent forgery to a hotel. There, Carl gets surprised to learn that Frank is still a guest and enters his room to arrest him. Frank then comes out of the restroom wearing a suit and blatantly assumes the identity of Agent Barry Allen of the U.S. Secret Service, claiming to have just arrested the suspect before Carl arrived. Frank acts so confidently that Carl believes him and lets him go. It's only later that Carl realizes he was fooled by Frank. After the encounter, Carl's description and the information in the room provide no other leads and fingerprints are not found. Frank learns that he has several nicknames, including the Skywayman and the James Bond of the Sky, during another interview with the Pan Am Brass. Frank gets inspired by this title and goes out and buys a Bond-style suit and an Aston Martin car, which he then drives about for fun. Soon after, he meets Cheryl Ann, a magazine model, at the hotel where he is staying. When Cheryl offers to sleep with Frank for $1,000, Frank replies that he only has a check for $1,400. As a result, Cheryl pays $400 in exchange for sleeping with Frank. Frank soon attempts to get his parents back together by using his stolen money. He hands the keys to a brand new Cadillac and invites his father to a posh restaurant, but his father doesn't accept the present. On Christmas Eve a few months later, Frank phones Carl while working alone at the FBI office to apologize for misleading him earlier. Carl refuses to accept the apology and challenges Frank to a face-to-face meeting. Carl is given Frank's address and room number, but Carl doesn't take him seriously. Carl quickly ascertains the reason for the call. Frank has no one else to talk to as the conversation continues. Carl resumes his inquiry with newfound vigor as Frank abruptly hangs up. Carl later learns that a figure named Barry Allen appears in the Flash comic books. He assumes that Frank might be a minor, which would explain why they have yet to be able to locate any records of him or match him using fingerprints. Carl instructs his troops to search for fugitives in the New York region after recalling that Frank had mentioned the New York Yankees during their phone chat. In the end, they locate Frank's mother, who has since wedded Jack Barnes. Carl quickly identifies Frank and learns his real name. He then tells Frank's mother that Frank has already committed check fraud of roughly $1.3 million. Later, when visiting a buddy at an Atlanta hospital, Frank encounters and develops a crush on a young nurse, Brenda Strong. He chooses to enroll with the hospital under the guise of a doctor, forging his Harvard Medical School diploma and fabricating an impressive fake resume. Brenda will be on his staff once he is appointed as the emergency room night administrator. Frank can persuade the medical interns on his team to step up and make medical calls on their own despite having no medical training, allowing him to handle the business end of things without ever having to interact with patients. He finally succeeds in winning Brenda over, and the two start dating. Frank tries to help her reconnect with her family by proposing to Brenda after learning that her parents rejected her when she had an abortion. Carl visits Frank's father, who refuses to give information on his son. However, Carl discovers a letter from Frank with his Atlanta address. Carl and his team arrive at Frank's house using the address. Frank was meeting with Brenda's parents in Louisiana, where he lies that he is a licensed doctor and lawyer. Impressed by Frank, Brenda's parents allow the two to get engaged. Meanwhile, Carl recognizes Frank's new alias on his Harvard graduation, which leads him to the hospital where Frank has already resigned. Frank is serving as an assistant prosecutor after passing the bar test for lawyers. Frank returns to New York to see his father. Frank Sr., who is currently working for the U.S. Postal Service and is still having problems with the IRS, tells his son that his mother has married Jack Barnes and has moved on, which breaks Frank's heart. He also says that the FBI visited him, and they know what Frank is doing. His crew is listening in on the call as Frank calls Carl at the FBI office. Carl had been looking forward to the phone call. Carl is told to stop pursuing Frank since he is finished and ready to settle down. Carl tells him that this is not possible because Frank has already stolen $4 million. Frank acknowledges and hangs up, not realizing that informing Carl about the engagement was a mistake. Carl, who discovered Frank's identity in Atlanta, believes Frank was forced to keep his alias when he moved to Louisiana because he is dating a woman who believes it is his true name. Carl and his men find Frank after searching through wedding announcements on the night of the engagement party. Meanwhile, Frank confesses to Brenda who he really is and requests that Brenda meet him at the nearby airport. Frank is shocked to discover Brenda is being closely followed by numerous FBI officers in disguise when Brenda shows up as expected. When Frank doesn't show up, Carl instructs his men to guard the airport. Frank visits a nearby college to solicit stewardesses to fly to Europe by posing as a recruiting pilot. He selects the sexiest women and puts them in uniforms for auditions. Next, he travels to the airport, where he maneuvers through the crowd while utilizing the women to completely divert the security personnel from ever looking at him. Frank avoids Carl's troops and flees to Europe. 7 months later, in 1967, Carl informs his boss that Frank has been forging checks throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. The checks are accurate this time. He asks for permission to find Frank in Europe, claiming he is out of control. But his supervisor refuses to give him permission, arguing that if Carl could not capture Frank while he was in the USA, he would not be able to do so in Europe. Carl isn't going down without a fight, so he takes one of Frank's fake checks to a professional printer who determines from the check's quality that it must have been made on a particular type of printer that is only found in a few European nations, one of which is France. So Carl flies to France and discovers Frank on Christmas Eve working inside a sizable printing facility. He informs Frank that he vowed to have the French police arrest him when he arrived with them. Frank believes Carl is lying, but Carl persuades him that he will be shot if he tries to escape. Frank consents to place handcuffs on himself, and Carl then leads him outside. Carl pledges to get Frank extradited back to the USA, but soon after, the French police escort Frank to prison. The movie's introduction shows that Frank is released into Carl's care after 2 years. On Christmas Eve, 1969, the plane extraditing Frank flies into the United States. Carl explains to Frank, who had repeatedly asked him to phone his father, that Frank Sr. passed away the year before. Devastated, Frank locks himself in the washroom of the aircraft and makes his way outside to find out where his mother resides. They follow Frank's trail of destruction to the Barnes household, where they discover his mother living happily with her second husband and raising a small daughter. When Carl arrives with backup, Frank gently gives up, seeing his mother has moved on and his father has passed away. He is then taken into custody before his mom and her new family realize who he is. Frank is finally tried, found guilty, and given a 12-year term in solitary confinement in an Atlanta maximum security federal prison. Carl frequently visits Frank during the following 4 years, especially at Christmas. At one of these encounters, Frank quickly spots a forgery Carl is pursuing by casually showing him a check, which gives the FBI agent an idea. Carl pays Frank another visit a while later, but he brings his boss along with him. They hand Frank a check, which he promptly recognizes as false, making Carl smile. In 1974, Carl decided that Frank might complete the remainder of his sentence while in his care, working for the FBI's division devoted to combating check fraud. Despite being released from prison, Frank remains confined to a desk job and longs for the excitement of his former life. When he finds a pilot uniform, Frank is forced to pretend to be an airline pilot. Carl joins him at the airport just as he is ready to take off. But Carl decides to let him leave, trusting that Frank will come back to work. When Frank doesn't arrive for work on Monday morning, Carl is anxious to return to the workplace. Frank does, however, arrive, and the two start discussing a freshly uncovered check forgery that demonstrates some novel forgery techniques they haven't seen before. Then, Carl asks Frank a question which has been on his mind for years. Carl asks Frank how he cheated on the Louisiana bar test to become a lawyer. Frank asserts that he did not use any methods of cheating, and that he successfully completed the exam after 2 weeks of diligent study. Carl asks if this is true, but Frank concentrates on the current case and continues. Scrolling text then reveals that Frank has been happily married for 26 years, has 3 sons, lives in the Midwest with his family, is close with Carl, has apprehended some of the most elusive check forgers in the history of the world, and makes millions of dollars a year from his work creating unforgeable checks. This movie has a rating of 8.1 on IMDb. Thank you so much for watching till the end. If you liked the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel for more movie recaps. Until then, take care and see you in the next video.